Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so pleased to see you in person. We've missed you basically for the last 2 years. And of course, we're very delighted for Professor Steve Koonin to be able to travel from New York to London and have him here to give tonight's annual GWPF lecture. Some of you may have read his best-selling book, Unsettled, what the title of his lecture. And if you haven't read it, please do. It's one of the best books on the current state of climate science and the climate debate, discussing what we know tentatively, and what we don't know. But essentially what Steve has done is to translate the IPCC reports into plain English. And he has turned what is an extremely complex and convoluted and highly theoretical document into a reader-friendly book that allows ordinary people to understand the main findings, the main conclusions of the IPCC. That's what he's done. Now, here's the thing. Now, given that he's basically tried to explain to ordinary people what these complex documents actually say, why are climate activists so enraged about it and about his assessment? And I was, this question, I was trying to find a historical analogy to a situation where someone was using a kind of authoritative document and translating it for everyday use and for ordinary people. And then I remembered the 16th century scholar William Tyndale, who basically translated the Bible into English. And he got into trouble. He was eventually burned. But what is interesting is he actually questioned the then 99.9% consensus that the scriptures could only be interpreted by approved clergy, and that his translation allowed ordinary people, lay people, to read, to analyze, to interpret scripture independently. And in fact, I didn't know that, but anyone found in a possession of a English translation of the Bible faced the death penalty at the time. So his translation was a genuine threat to the consensus and to the leadership of the then elite. And of course, he also took advantage of what then was called social media, the press, the printing press, which disseminated his translation. Anyway, he was arrested, he was burned, he was strangled. And we are, of course, very thankful that after 500 years of progress, eminent scholars accused of being heretics are no longer burned or strangulated, and certainly not in this room. Steve, it's all over to you.
Thank you, Benny. That's got to be one of the best introductions I think I've ever had. Thank you. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight, and of course thanks to GWPF for allowing me to talk to you and deliver what I think is a very important message, because we're talking about policy. This is the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I wanted to start with some thoughts about policy and observations. Policies ultimately express values and priorities. With respect to energy and climate, we need to consider risk tolerance, intergenerational equity, geographical equity, and so on, but they must be informed by a clear picture of the scientific certainties and uncertainties. So let's have a look at what some of our current policymakers say about the science. The first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order and said, I'm going to listen to the science. Over here on this side of the pond, we have your PM saying recently it's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we all need to act now. In August 9th, when the UN released its most recent scientific assessment, AR6 as it's called, Secretary General Guterres said it's code red for humanity and billions of people are at immediate risk. And over mostly in the States, you have people talking about existential threat, climate crisis, climate catastrophe, climate disaster, and so on. Not only Mark Carney, who is perhaps familiar on this side of the pond, but also my good friend Ernie Moniz, who was Secretary of Energy in the second Obama administration, of course, Bill Gates, and so on. And then in the US, importantly, the leadership of the Pentagon, General Lloyd Austin, has elevated climate crisis to an existential national security threat, which means we better take it seriously. Where are all these folks getting their information from? Well, it starts with the assessment reports that are issued periodically by the UN, the US government, the UK government does them occasionally as well. The penultimate assessment report was issued in 2014, AR5 by the UN IPCC, and as I mentioned on August 9th, we had AR6. And then the US issues its national climate assessment every 4 years. The last came out in 2018 in 2 volumes, 2017, the Climate Science Special Report, and then the full rest of the report in 2018. The 5th one is expected in a couple years. When you read these reports, and I have, they say important and surprising things. But I can guarantee you that none of the people I showed you on the previous slide have ever read these reports. All right? And when you read them, as I said, they say some interesting and surprising things. The way I like to characterize it is to paraphrase a quote from the Princess Bride movie. One of the characters, Vizzini, keeps saying the word inconceivable. And at some point, the main character, Inigo Montoya, gets really mad and he says, you know, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. And in this case, I don't think the science says what most people think it says. There are some surprises. Let me give you a couple of, not cherries, but in fact salient facts from these reports. At least in the US, despite the fact that the average temperature has indeed gone up since 1960, heat waves are now no more common than they were in 1900, and the warmest temperatures of the year have not gone up in the past 50 years. That's right there in the Climate Science Special Report. The global fire record shows about a 25% decrease since 2003 in the land area burned, and last year was one of the least active years on record, and I have a link there where you can find that reference. Greenland's ice sheet is not melting any more rapidly in recent decades than it was 8 decades ago. Again, it's right there in the data. And there is no detectable trend or human influence on tropical cyclones, hurricanes, over the last century. And maybe most surprisingly, when you read the reports, both the UN and US government, the net economic impact of a warming of up to 6 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Remember, Paris is aiming at 2 or maybe 1.5. 6 degrees will be minimal. The statements like these and many others that you can find in the reports belie the canon of climate catastrophe. We've already broken the climate, and we need to take drastic action in order to prevent catastrophe. It's interesting, when the UN report came out on August 9th, Guterres said, as I mentioned, code red for humanity. When you search all 3,949 pages of that report, written by a couple hundred scientists over 3 years, you don't find the words existential threat, climate catastrophe, climate disaster at all. You find the words climate crisis exactly once, And that's not a scientific finding, but it is in reference to the way in which the media have amped up their coverage. So how is it that the science, which is pretty good science, or at least as good as any other field I know in the literature, how does it get turned into the science that everybody quotes? And the answer is it's a long game of telephone. It starts with the fundamental data and the research papers. It goes into these assessment reports, which survey and distill the science. It then goes on to the summaries for policymakers in those reports, and then on to the media and the politicians. And as you go through this chain, there are ample opportunities to distort or to misinform. Confusing weather with climate. As we shall see in some examples, climate is a 30-year average. Weather is what happens every day or every year. They are not the same thing. People confuse climate change with a changing climate. Climate change has come to mean changes due to human influences. The climate changes, as we shall see, for perfectly good reasons on its own, and people mix them up. People highlight recent trends without taking historical context into account. We see implausibly extreme emissions scenarios labeled as business as usual in order to amp up the effects of human-caused climate change. We see minimization of uncertainties. We see alarming predictions that never come to pass, and everybody forgets about them. And whether it's coral reefs or disappearing islands, take your pick. Disappearing polar bears is another one that has gone in recent years. A lot of it is driven by non-expert and activist reporters. If you're a reporter covering the climate beat, unless you say something dramatic, you're not going to get on the front page. So you've got that. And then there is suppression of legitimate divergence from the consensus. I've seen it myself in the past 6 months since the book has been published. Nobody wants to listen. Fingers in the ears, eyes shut. I wrote the book, as Benny said, to try to get around this long chain of information. Almost everything in the book is right there in the official reports or in the peer-reviewed literature. So not my science, but what the official science is. Let me go through a couple of examples and talk about hurricanes. The top panel is the record of the number of storms over the last 50 years. The bottom panel is a record of activity, which is, for those of you who are technical, it's the number of storms weighted by their duration and the square of their wind velocity. And while there are lots of ups and downs, there is no long-term trend. And in fact, the US government report in 2017 said there's still low confidence that any reported long-term, multi-decadal to centennial trend exists in tropical cyclones. And in AR6, it said there's low confidence in most reported long-term trends in tropical cyclones. They did say there is some indication of a strengthening of the fraction of the strongest storms in the last 40 years. That was based on one paper, but then there was a paper published in July which said, no, we think that's just natural variability. So that little bit, at least, is still unsettled. I'm going to talk about sea level rise, which is one of the most iconic threats that are invoked to talk about climate change. Most people don't realize that sea level has been rising for 20,000 years. And during that time, it rose 120 meters as the last glaciers melted and the water flowed back into the ocean basin. So the question is not whether sea level is rising, which is a common alarm cry you hear in the media, but in fact, has it accelerated, let's say over the last 70 years, under growing human influences? To what extent is that acceleration really anthropogenic as opposed to natural? And of course, what's going to happen in the next century, let's say, as human influences grow and greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere? Well, this is a great example of how the UN report is entirely disingenuous and obscures the whole issue. The only place in the report where you can find any notion of the historical data is that figure shown on the upper right, which is from the Summary for Policymakers. You see since 1950, the data, the black line, and then various projections under various emissions scenarios. And if you then look at the text that they describe sea level rise with, they say global mean sea level increased by 0.2 of a meter between 1901 and 2018. The average rate of sea level rise was 1.3 millimeters a year between 01 and 71, increasing to 1.9 millimeters a year between 71 and 06, and further increasing to 3.7 millimeters a year between 06 and 18. That sounds really scary, right? It's going up faster and faster. Well, if you look at one of the papers that the report cites approvingly, you find this graph of sea level rate since 1901. And if you just pay attention to the blue curve, you can see the observed, the data. And look at how the language in the report maps on to the data. First period, 01 to 71. Second period, 71 to 06. Third period, 06 to 18. All right? I would have failed one of my students if they had done this. Well, that's why I have been calling for a more rigorous review of these reports to make sure that they are accurate, complete, unbiased, and so on. And in fact, the IPCC itself admitted it in the last report. They said it's likely that there are similarly high rates between 1920 and 1950. Exactly why it goes up and down, we don't know. It's got to do with changes in the melt rate in mountain glaciers, Greenland, and so on. But nevertheless, you should not obscure the fact that past decades were about as active as the current decades, which detracts from the notion that it's all anthropogenic in recent decades. When you look at the projections for sea level rise going forward, they're also extraordinary, if I can be polite. I live in New York City, and so I looked up the battery. There's a NASA website, which I've quoted up there, that gives you the IPCC projections. There's a wonderful map of the globe. You can click on any coastal site and say, what's sea level going to do in the future, according to the IPCC? And the black trace is the historical data for the sea level at the battery, which is the tip of Manhattan. And surprisingly, the rate goes up and down. It's got to do with variability in the North Atlantic. In the 1940s, it was down less than 2 millimeters a year, and in the 1960s, it was up to about 5. Then it went down, and now it's going up again. If you had a bet, it's going to go down again. Nevertheless, the IPCC gives us projections under various emissions scenarios. The error bars are the gold vertical bars, 1 sigma uncertainty, and they're all completely disconnected with what we see currently. And, as my friend Will Happer would have said, I'll bet my house that none of that comes to pass. In fact, the researchers know that. This is a quote from a paper in 2019 by Helen Nissen and collaborators at Columbia University, firmly in the mainstream of climate scientists. The use of these climate models to guide local practical actions is unwarranted. The models are unable to represent future conditions with the degree of spatial, temporal, and probabilistic precision with which they're often provided, giving a false impression of confidence to users. All right? So they're saying, don't pay attention. Nevertheless, the IPCC is out there putting out this stuff. Climate, I want to talk about extremes now, and one should remember that climate plays out over decades. What happens in 1 year or even a few years is not climate. And in order to illustrate that, I want to talk about denial. Not science denial, but the river Nile in Egypt. All right? If you go to Cairo, you can find Rhoda Island in the center of the city. And on the southern tip of that island is a structure that was built in the middle of the 7th century by the Egyptians in order to measure the height of the Nile River. That's what it looks like. On the inside, it's a tall vertical chamber with 3 outlets to the river and a central column marked in cubits to measure the height of the river. Needless to say, was very important to Egyptian civilization, not only for agriculture, but also for taxation, since whoever was running Egypt would tax depending upon what the agricultural yield was in a given year. The Egyptians were very diligent about keeping records, and so we're fortunate to have a very long record, in this case the minimum height of the Nile River, going from the middle of the 7th century up to sometime in the middle of the 14th century, year by year. And when you look at that record, there are 2 remarkable things. One is how much it goes up and down every year. There are some years where it's up to 5 meters or so, and then the next year it's down to 1 meter or less. So highly variable, that's weather. If you take a 30-year average, as indicated by the red trace, it looks smoother, but nevertheless there are large fluctuations. And I can just imagine looking at that onset of low water from the middle of the 7th century for about 100 years, that there was some medieval climate panel screaming, "New normal, new normal," and urging prayers and sacrifices. And of course, if they just waited 100 years, it came back up, and even a couple 100 years, it came up back even higher. NASA is still at it, all right? In 2006, NASA published a new story, Lake Victoria's Falling Waters. This height is determined mostly by Lake Victoria in the summer. And then in 2021, last year, Lake Victoria's Rising Waters, all right? So this should give us a little bit of humility in trying to project at least regional climates. Global climate's a different story. So let me talk about extremes a little bit. We saw historic heat waves in the US Northwest this past summer. But if you look at the data, it was a singular occurrence. This is a chart of the number of daily records in 674 US stations in black and 26 stations in Oregon and Washington State in the US Northwest. There is no long-term trend. So whatever happened last summer was a singular event. If we saw it 10 times in the next 10 years, then we can start to talk about climate, but not now. Similarly, precipitation extremes. AR6 says, in fact, extreme precipitations are increasing on the land over the globe. That's true. And in the US, you can see the fraction of the US that is subject to extreme precipitations has gone up over the last century from 10% to 15% or so. Okay. So I live in New York City, and in September of this past year, we had a record 1-hour rainfall in Central Park. So, of course, I was interested to examine the historical record. How unusual was that? This, to their credit, was published in the New York Times in Newark, New Jersey. It shows record 1-hour precipitation since 1960. And you can see that event in the upper right was, in fact, singular, that happened on September 1st. But no clear trend in the data. I couldn't find 1-hour data going back further, but I could find 1-day data going back. And so here are the 16 rainiest days in the Central Park, Manhattan record. And you can see the most recent event, September 21st, is that red circle. But there are 4 other days in the record that were rainier. And 1879 was the rainiest day. So we tend to forget weather. We have a very poor memory. In the US, there was a severe drought in 1955. And one of the news magazines, Time or Newsweek, said, this drought will be long remembered. And in fact, it was forgotten after a year or two. Nobody remembers. So weather is not climate. I want to say a word about droughts in the US Southwest. This is the drought severity index. Up is wet and down is dry for about 1,000 years in the Southwest US. And what's remarkable, again, is lots of variation from year to year. We get this mostly from tree ring data. But there are some periods of multiple decades where it was very dry, and we know that those episodes clobbered civilizations. The Anasazi, for example, in New Mexico, got wiped out because of a drought around 1100. In California, over the last century, we do have, of course, good data. Here's the same kind of data, and you can see that over the last couple decades, California has been moving into drought. Whether this is anthropogenic or whether it's natural variability is still, I believe, up for grabs. Fires are often blamed on the drought, which is in turn blamed on human influences. But if you read the US government report from a couple of years ago, state-level fire data over the 20th century indicate that the area burned decreased from 1916 to 1940, was at a minimum, and then increased again. And here is the data from the US government. This is the amount of forest fire area burned over the US from 26 to 17. You see there was a peak in 1920, in the late 20s, early 30s, and then it fell dramatically, even as the US was warming. It hit a minimum, and then it went up again. How could that be? It was warming, and the fires went down. The answer is Smokey the Bear, all right? The US Forest Service started a deliberate policy of fire exclusion that lasted until the late 20th century. And then they started to relax again. When you do that, you get before and after pictures like this. The upper picture, these are scenes, the same scene in a park, a national park in Montana. The early picture from 1900 shows what the landscape looked like. 1981, if you don't let fires burn, you develop lots of trees. And you lose that beautiful mosaic of the landscape where there are clear patches that prevent fires from spreading. And so it's not surprising that when it gets dry, you're going to see fires. So the recent fires, some combination of forest management, development. There are more people in the forest than ever before. We have towns like Paradise in the middle of the forest. And then we've got drought conditions. Whether it's natural or anthropogenic, up for grabs, but there are certainly things we can do to mitigate the fires. Let me talk about the economic impact of warming. This is the last of the impact things I want to talk about. This is the one that really surprised me when I sort of figured it out and understood it. The National Climate Assessment in 2018 said climate change is projected to impose substantial damages on the economy, hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century. And to back that up, they give you this chart right out of the report. This is another one of these remarkable charts. The more you study it, you wonder what were they thinking. Sector by sector, starting with labor, mortality, freshwater fish, harmful algal blooms, showing the annual damages in the end of the century, 2090, compared to under an extreme emission scenario, and then the last column, how much of those damages you would avoid. And this chart is remarkable for the granularity with which they think they can project 70 years forward, for the precision with which they quote the numbers. That first number in the labor sector is 155 billion, not 153 and not 157, 155. And then finally, they give you no baseline. They say we could avoid 48% of those damages if we reduce emissions, but you got to figure that the labor sector is probably half the economy. That's $10 trillion today, even more in 2090, and so this is in the noise. Nevertheless, we get these wonderful headlines in the US papers. Even Fox News says grim economic consequences, etc. Here's the graph. It shows economic damages to the US. The IPCC has a similar graph for the global impact as a function of temperature change. And what you can see, apologies, it's in Fahrenheit, but 9 degrees Fahrenheit would be 5 degrees warming relative to today, 6 degrees relative to pre-industrial. You can see it's a few percent. Bjorn Lomborg has a similar graph, more recent data from a variety of models. A few percent for a few degrees is what you should keep in your mind. But it's at worst a bump in the road, and the IPCC says that. This is from AR5. Basically, it says climate change is only a small factor among many others that are more important in determining what the economy is going to do. And in fact, you can make a little graph, as I did. This shows the US economy today at $20 trillion, growing at 2%. And then if you impose a 4% climate impact at the end of the century, or even a 10%, it's a few years worth of delay, 70 or 80 years from now in economic growth. All right? Why doesn't anybody talk about this? Is this really the climate crisis? I'd love to have somebody like Bill Gates or Ernie on the stage and ask them, you know, what's going on? People will say, don't believe this, but then I say, but that's the official report. If you don't believe it, we should have a better scrub of these reports. Okay, let me turn to more recent events. It's kind of my last major chapter, and talk about COP26 a little bit. You know, we physicists are trained in part to think about fundamentals, not get lost in the details. So we have, when we talk about physical systems, conservation of energy, the second law of thermodynamics, whatever the details, these are the things that determine what will happen. And looking at the situation with that fundamental perspective, net zero by 2050 is a fantasy. Right? And even by 2070 or 2075, I would say extraordinarily unlikely. And as you listen to the political leaders, read the news, it feels like that. Right? So that's why Wile E. Coyote, who got chased off by the roadrunner, a cliff, you know, the general principles say he's going to fall. And he's just kind of realized that and is really worried. All right? That's what COP26 is like. Right? Okay. Let me talk separately about the developed world and then the developing and developed world. General principles. Energy is crucial for modern society. It's ubiquitous. It touches everything. It's provided by complicated systems that very few of us have taken the trouble to understand. Those systems are highly reliable because we have proven the hardware and developed the procedures. Energy systems change slowly. This shows the US energy supply over 70 years. And it takes decades to change, and the renewables are that last little bit in blue up there. Eventually they'll get more important and grow, but it's going to take decades. They change slowly because of that need for reliability. Things need to operate with one another. Vehicles and fuels need to be the same. It takes a lot of money to build these systems. They live for a long time. There are many stakeholders, and so when you try to change it, it takes a long time because everybody has different opinions. People say efficiency can help, but Jevons, one of my British heroes from the 19th century, reminded us that just because you make something more efficient doesn't mean you're going to use less of it. So my bottom line here is ill-conceived changes in the energy system done rapidly are going to be very disruptive. The economy, to the employment, behavior, geopolitics. You're seeing this already in this country. We're starting to see it in the US. And I think if one goes too much, too fast, there's going to be a backlash. Remember that the US is only 13% of global emissions. The UK is about 1/10 of that. And people are going to say, why are we doing all of this again? Okay. It's coming, wait. If we look at the developing world, 6 billion people, energy demand is extraordinarily well correlated with economic well-being. And as these people improve their lives, they're going to need more energy. About 50% more by 2050 than the world uses today. Today, fossil fuels are the most convenient and reliable way of meeting that demand. And in fact, the rest of the world now dominates global emissions and will do that even more so in the coming decades. Countries have a near-term compelling interest in getting that energy. If you're threatened by a wolf, you're not too worried about your cholesterol. All right? It is the short term that really matters. All right? And so you see India, China, pick your favorite big developing country, all saying, we need the energy, and we'll worry about this emission stuff some other time. And I think you can make a very good case that to say countries cannot get this energy in the most convenient way that they can is immoral, unless you're willing to pay for it, and we've seen how far that works, all right? So, no. All right. If you want to decarbonize, there is an optimal pace for decarbonization. William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018 for the realization that if you go too fast, you incur costs from disruption, and you incur costs by deploying immature technology. But if you go too slow, you incur greater risk, however that might be, from growing anthropogenic influences. And so there's an optimum. And when he wrote his Nobel lecture, the optimum path was to let the world go 3 or more degrees warming by 2100, not the 1.5 or 2 degrees. Of course, as this started to gain prominence, lots of other people weighed in and said, you did it wrong, and the real answer is 1.5 degrees. But in fact, we'll get a pretty good sense over the next decade of how well we adapt and what rate we should be decarbonizing at. But I would assert, because the impacts are so small, we got time. Okay. Time is running, and I know we want to get some questions, so I'm going to skip a discussion of the grid, and let me just close. Adaptation will be the dominant response. Whatever you think the world should do, the world is going to adapt, and that's the best way it's going to respond to a changing climate. Adaptation is agnostic. It doesn't matter whether the changes are human-caused or natural. It is proportional. If the climate changes more, we'll adapt more. If less, we'll adapt less. It's also local, and so far more easy to implement. People are willing to pay for local measures in the here and now. It's very hard to get them to pay for something that is an uncertain threat 2 generations away and halfway around the world. It's also autonomous. It's what we do. We humans are wonderful at adapting, and it's very effective. Of course, it's a lot easier to adapt if you're richer than you're poorer. And so one might argue that the best thing we can do is to help developing countries move along, strengthen their institutions, become more prosperous and resilient. It's also a lot easier if you know what you're adapting to. And as I told you about projections of regional climates, it's not very good. All right. Couple of closing thoughts. We must not Gruberize climate science. All right. You're in the UK, you may not get the illusion. Let me explain. Jonathan Gruber is a professor of economics at MIT. Sorry, he's an economist, but he's still on the faculty. He was one of the principal architects of the Obamacare Act, the Affordable Care Act. I know healthcare is not so much of an issue here in the UK. You have NHS, but it is a big deal in the US. I know. My tongue was in my cheek. And look what he said, all right, after it was all over. The lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. It was really, really critical to getting the Affordable Care Act passed. At least one of the key provisions was a very clever basic exploitation of the lack of economic understanding of the American voter. All right? And I can tell you, as an educator and as someone who's advised on science, that is just so wrong. When you misrepresent the science to persuade rather than inform, you take away the right of the public and the politicians to make fully informed decisions. You distract from more urgent needs, of which we have so many, that are more immediate, more real, and more tractable. You tarnish science inputs to other important policy matters. COVID is the most outstanding example. And then you terrify young people, and this is so bad. And so that's why I wrote the book. All right. Recommended course going forward, I can't be all negative. I got to at least talk about, what positive things we can do. The first thing we can do is get authoritative bodies. like the Royal Society, the US National Academies, to stand up and say, there is no climate crisis, all right? This is an issue. We can deal with it in due course, but let's all relax a little bit. All right? We need better representations of the science for non-experts, and as some of you know, I have long advocated for red team reviews of the reports. Better observations, better understanding, of course, a greater focus on adaptation. We have no framework for thinking about adaptation. We don't have good estimates of the cost. And of course, as I mentioned, help the developing countries along. Development and demonstration for emissions-light technologies, absolutely, okay? Fission, I put on the top of the list, and it's reassuring, actually, to see this country, the Germans, the US, start to put nuclear power higher on the agenda in terms of research. Small reactors, we really need to get those underway. Grid storage and management, I co-convened with Chris Llewellyn-Smith in this country a US-UK workshop on grid-level storage in the spring. There will be a report coming out soon. I can tell you that we need a lot of research before we can think about an all-renewable grid that's reliable. And let us formulate some graceful decarbonization pathways that respect the technology, the economics, the regulation, the behavior. Nobody has done that. The current plans for decarbonization are kind of one-dimensional, put together either by politicians or, if you'll excuse me, academics who have no sense of the real world. And we need to do this, all right? And then implement them as necessary. I'll just close with the thought that precipitous climate action can be much more dangerous than any climate change you can imagine. Thank you for your attention.